The first time Ethan Calloway heard the warrior man's voice, it rolled across the desert like a storm coming low over the mountains, soft, steady, and yet carrying the weight of something ancient. "You're too special for me," it said. Ethan froze where he stood, shovel still in his calloused hand, the earth half turned at his feet. The late afternoon sun blazed gold against the mesas, throwing long shadows across his lonely ranch. Dust rose from the dry soil and clung to his sweat-soaked shirt. For a moment, he thought the heat had tricked his mind, that he had imagined a voice born of loneliness and endless work. But then he looked up, and there he was. A man, tall and broad-shouldered, stood at the edge of the field where sagebrush grew wild and stubborn. His skin caught the glow of the setting sun, warm copper and bronze, his chest bare and marked by scars that told of battles Ethan couldn't begin to imagine. Long black hair hung past his shoulders, tied back with beads that glittered like sparks. Tribal jewelry rested against his collarbone, bone and stone carved with symbols that seemed to whisper of stories older than the land itself. His dark eyes, sharp, unflinching, fixed on Ethan with a gaze that sent a shiver down his spine. The ranch was silent. No cattle lowed, no hawk cried overhead, no wind stirred the mesquite. Even the earth seemed to hold its breath. Ethan's own heartbeat sounded too loud in his ears. He swallowed, shifting the shovel nervously between his palms, though it felt ridiculous, a tool meant for digging, not defending. The warrior did not move closer. He simply stood there, a figure cut out of the desert twilight, as if he belonged to another world altogether. His voice, when it came again, was softer but no less certain. "You carry a spirit," the warrior said, the words thick with an accent shaped by another tongue. "It is not for death." Ethan blinked. His mouth opened, but nothing came out. What did that mean? Who was this man? And how did he know anything about him? Loneliness had been Ethan's only companion for years. Since Clara died, his wife, his joy, his anchor, the ranch had been nothing but empty rooms and the endless cycle of work. He rose before the sun, tended what little livestock remained, mended fences broken by wind and coyotes, and collapsed at night onto a bed that always felt too big. He hadn't spoken to another soul in weeks. The sudden presence of this stranger unsettled him more than a rattlesnake at his feet. He wanted to demand answers. "Who are you? What do you mean?" But before he could, the warrior man stepped back into the fading light. His figure blurred with the shadows of the brush, and in a blink he was gone, swallowed by the desert. Ethan dropped the shovel, his hands trembling despite the warmth of the evening. He spun, scanning the horizon, but found nothing, no horse, no footprints, not even a stirring of the dry earth. As if the man had been a vision conjured from grief and solitude. The sun slipped behind the mesas, turning the sky to fire and then to ash. The crickets began their chorus. Ethan stood alone in his field, staring at the place where the warrior had stood, his heart racing. That night, sleep refused him. He lay in the darkness of his small ranch house, the wood walls creaking with the desert wind. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard the voice again. "You're too special for me." The words echoed through him like a prayer and a curse all at once. He tried to make sense of it. Was it a warning? A threat? A plea? He replayed the details in his mind, the warrior's scars, his eyes that seemed to look into places Ethan himself tried to avoid. He remembered the strange calm in his tone, not the harshness of an enemy, but the sorrow of a man carrying a burden. Ethan sat up in bed, running a hand through his unkempt hair. He told himself it was a trick of the mind, a dream shaped by solitude. But deep down, a gnawing certainty took root. The man had been real. His words had weight. And something was coming, something bigger than Ethan could see. The desert outside lay still under a blanket of stars, coyotes howling far off in the canyons. Ethan's horse stirred restlessly in the corral, sensing something its master could not. Ethan didn't know it yet, but by the next sunset, the silence of his ranch would be shattered, not by loneliness, but by the thunder of hooves and the glow of 1,000 torches, and the words of the warrior man would no longer feel like a mystery, they would feel like fate. The following morning broke under skies the color of dull steel, the kind that promised a storm without quite delivering it. Ethan Calloway woke with grit in his mouth and unease in his bones. He had dreamed of the warrior all night, the voice, the eyes, the strange certainty in his tone. You have a spirit. It is not for death. Those words clung to Ethan like burrs, refusing to shake loose. He pushed himself out of bed, the wooden floor cold against his bare feet, and poured a cup of stale coffee from the pot he'd left on the stove. His ranch house smelled of dust, wood smoke, and loneliness. The silence was almost too heavy to bear, the kind that made every creak of the old walls sound like an intruder's step. He longed for the sound of laughter, or even Clara's voice humming a hymn as she worked, but those belonged to another life, one buried deep in the red earth with her dot after finishing his coffee. Ethan tugged on his boots and stepped outside. The air was cool, dry, and still, with clouds hanging low over the mesas. His horse, a dappled gray mare named Juniper, shifted nervously in the corral, ears flicking as though she, too, felt the strange weight of the previous night. Ethan busied himself with the day's chores, anything to keep his mind from turning circles around that encounter. He mended a fence, drew water from the well, and forked hay into the trough. Each task was mechanical, the rhythm of a life he had known for years, and yet the world felt different. His every movement seemed watched, measured, as though the desert itself was holding judgment. By noon, the sun had fought through the clouds, and heat shimmered across the plains. Ethan found himself near the same field where he had seen the warrior. He stopped, shovel in hand again, staring at the place where the man had stood. The sagebrush swayed gently in the breeze, but nothing else stirred. No tracks, no broken branches, no trace that anyone had been there. It gnawed at him. He crouched low, pressing his palm against the dirt. The soil was dry, cracked, unforgiving like it always was. He should have been relieved to find nothing, but instead he felt hollow. He wanted proof, some mark in the earth that would tell him he hadn't imagined it all. "Who are you?" Ethan muttered under his breath, the sound carried away by the wind. As the afternoon dragged on, he couldn't shake the memory of the warrior's face, haunted yet unbroken, proud yet sorrowful. That voice had carried more than words. It had carried burden, like a man speaking not only for himself, but for generations behind him. Ethan had felt it deep in his chest, where his grief sat like a stone. When dusk approached, he decided to saddle Juniper and ride into town. He needed voices, faces, something to anchor him back into the ordinary. As he cinched the saddle tight, though, he noticed something strange. Hoof prints, faint but clear, near the edge of his land. He frowned, kneeling to study them. The impressions were fresh, pressed deep into the dirt, and not from a single rider. There were many, perhaps a dozen, perhaps more. His stomach tightened. These weren't his, and they hadn't come from the direction of town. He followed them a short distance, and the more he looked, the worse his unease grew. The ground bore marks of horses ridden hard, as though driven by purpose, not aimless wandering. He crouched. Again, running his fingers over the grooves, his heartbeat thudding in his ears. Every story he'd ever heard in the saloon about watching eyes from the hills, about tribes biding their time, surged back into his mind. He had always dismissed them as exaggerations, old men trying to keep fear alive, ranchers spinning tailies over whiskey. But these prints were real. The earth did not lie. Ethan rose slowly, scanning the horizon. The mesas loomed dark against the sinking sun, silent and unmoving. Yet he couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere, just beyond sight, eyes were fixed on him. By the time he returned to the ranch house, twilight had fallen and shadows stretched long and sharp across the land. He lit a lantern, setting it on the table, but the soft glow only seemed to deepen the darkness pressing in outside. He sat heavily in his chair, running a hand down his face, torn between disbelief and dread. The warrior's words returned again, unbidden, as if whispered directly into his ear. "You're too special for me." Ethan gripped the edge of the table until his knuckles turned white. If that man's sudden appearance had been meant as a warning, then the hoof prints were the proof. He wasn't being haunted by loneliness. He was being watched, and something or someone was coming. The day after Ethan found the hoof prints, the storm clouds returned, blacker and heavier than before. They stacked high above the mesas, their bellies swollen with rain that never seemed to fall. Only hanging there, pressing down on the land, Ethan woke early, stirred from uneasy dreams, and went straight to the corral. Juniper pawed the ground, her ears twitching, muscles tense. She was restless in a way that had nothing to do with weather. Horses knew things men pretended not to. He saddled her anyway, telling himself he needed to check the range fences, but in truth, he wanted to see if more signs had appeared. More proof that the prints weren't some trick of the night. The shovel and hammer he usually carried hung forgotten in the shed. Instead, he slipped his rifle into the saddle scabbard. He didn't like the feel of the steel, but a knot of dread sat heavy in his chest. The desert spread wide and empty around him as he rode. Mesquite trees clawed at the sky with dry, crooked limbs. The air smelled of sage and dust, thick and unmoving. And every sound seemed too sharp, the clop of Juniper's hooves, the creak of leather, the beat of his own heart. It didn't take long before he found them again. Hoof prints, fresh as spilled water, pressed deep into the earth, and not just a handful, hundreds. They ran like a river across the land, fanning out wide, circling, weaving close to the boundary of his ranch. Ethan dismounted, crouching low, his fingers brushing the impressions. He had grown up on horses, and he knew what he was looking at. These weren't cattle riders passing through, nor a few hunters moving quick. The tracks belonged to a mounted war party, their animals driven. Hard and steady, no meandering, no hesitation. Purpose stamped every line of the earth. His mouth went dry. He stood, rifle in hand, scanning the horizon. The mesas loomed silent, the wind carrying only the rattle of dry grass. Nothing moved. But Ethan could feel it, eyes, watching, measuring, deciding. He swung back into the saddle, urging Juniper toward the far ridge. He needed a vantage point, someplace high where he could see more than dust and sagebrush. The mare protested, snorting and tossing her head, but Ethan pressed her forward, the sense of urgency outweighing her nerves. When they reached the ridge, the view stretched for miles, rolling plains, jagged cliffs, and the thin dark line of the river winding through the distance. For a heartbeat, all seemed still. Then Ethan's stomach dropped. Movement. On the far horizon, barely more than shadows, he saw riders. Dozens of them. They didn't race or scatter like cowhands driving. Strays. They moved in a slow, deliberate wave, their silhouettes outlined against the storm-dark sky. Even at that distance, the formation spoke of discipline, of unity. Ethan pulled his hat lower, the brim shading his eyes as if that would make them less visible. He sat frozen in the saddle, not daring to move, watching the distant figures crawl. Like ants across the land, the warrior's words thundered back in his head. "You have a spirit? It is not for death. But what else could this be?" He felt smaller than he ever had, a single man on a patch of dirt no wider than a prayer. For years he had thought his loneliness was the heaviest burden he'd ever bear. Now he realized how Light it had been compared to this being seen, being chosen, in ways he did not understand. By the time Ethan made it back to the ranch house, twilight was spreading its purple veil across the desert. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain that never fell. He paced the porch, rifle across his lap, eyes sweeping the horizon. Every shadow seemed to shift. Every sound made Juniper's ears flick and his heart pound. The prints had been too many to ignore, the riders too deliberate to dismiss, and the warrior's appearance too timely to call coincidence. Ethan's gut twisted with the truth he didn't want to name. He wasn't just being watched, he was being surrounded. When the last of the light faded, Ethan lit the lantern inside and sat at the table, staring at his own reflection in the warped glass of the window. His face looked older, harder, wearier than it had a week ago. But beneath the lines of exhaustion burned something else, a fire he hadn't felt in years. Fear, yes, but also defiance. He wasn't a man who wanted to fight. He wasn't even sure he could. But if the land he had broken his back over was to be swallowed whole, then by God, he would face it head on. He set the rifle across the table, his hands trembling only slightly as he loaded the rounds. The weight of the weapon was cold, but steady. Outside, the desert lay still under the dark, but Ethan could feel its hooves waiting in the distance. Breath held in the shadows, a storm of men and horses circling closer with each passing hour. Tomorrow, he knew, would not dawn the same. By the time night fell, Ethan's nerves were stretched thinner than a coyote's howl across the canyon. He had tried to eat, but the beans in his tin bowl had turned to ash in his mouth. He had tried to rest, but each creak of the floorboards, each groan of the wind outside, jerked him upright again. Finally, he sat on the porch, lantern dimmed low, rifle resting across his knees, and stared into the darkness as if daring it to reveal its secrets. The desert stretched endlessly before him, silvered by the rising moon. Juniper shifted restlessly. In the corral, stamping her hooves, her ears fixed toward the north. The air was too still, the kind of quiet that seemed to swallow sound rather than hold it. And then, faint at first, it began, a low thud. A drumbeat, steady and slow, rolling across the desert floor like thunder in the distance. Ethan's chest tightened. Another beat followed, then another, until the sound thickened, multiplied, echoed by dozens of drums in unison. The rhythm grew louder, closer, shaking the very boards beneath his boots. He rose to his feet, rifle clutched in both hands, heart hammering with the beat. And then he saw it. Across the ridge, a glow-bloomed orange fire against the night. Torches. Dozens, no hundreds. They moved like a serpent of flame across the land, circling, widening, encircling his ranch from every side. Ethan's breath caught. His throat felt dry as desert dust. The stories he had dismissed in the saloon of tribes gathering in silence, of ranchers waking to find themselves surrounded by fire, those stories had been true all along. And now it was him at the center. The hoofbeats followed next, a low rumble like rain on stone, growing louder, sharper. Shadows appeared on the horizon, first faint outlines, then mounted men, their silhouettes tall and fierce against the fire-lit sky. Horses stamped and tossed their heads, manes flashing in the torchlight. The riders moved as one, their faces painted with patterns of war, their eyes glittering like embers. Ethan's grip on his rifle tightened. He had never seen so many men together in his life, not even in the cattle drives. This was no scouting party. This was a wall of history and vengeance on horseback, and it had come straight to his door. The drumming ceased. The sudden silence struck harder than the sound. Ethan's ears rang with it, his pulse racing in his throat. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. From the front line of riders, a figure dismounted. Ethan knew him instantly, though the sight still sent a tremor through his bones. The warrior man. He walked forward slowly, deliberately, each step sending a ripple of authority through the circle of men behind him. His chest gleamed in the firelight, muscles taut and scarred from battles long past. Long black hair spilled. Over his shoulders, beads and feathers glinting as they swayed. Tribal jewelry carved from bone and stone lay heavy against him, the marks of his people and his rank. His eyes found Ethan's across the torchlit dark, steady and unreadable. He lifted a single hand, palm outward, and as if commanded by the earth itself, the drumming stopped. The hooves stilled. The torches hissed softly in the wind. The entire world seemed to collapse into silence, broken only by Ethan's quickening breath. The warrior stood just beyond the porch, his face cast half in shadow, half in flame. When he finally spoke, his voice was not loud, yet it carried through the night as though every star bent down to listen. You live on land that drinks blood. Ethan swallowed, his mouth dry, his hands trembling against the rifle. The warrior's gaze never wavered. Men before you brought death here. They hunted our buffalo. They burned our homes. The spirits remember. And the spirits demand balance. The words hung heavy in the air, each one striking harder than the last. Ethan wanted to speak, to cry out that he had done none of these things, that he had lived quietly, that his only sin had been surviving when so many he loved had not. But his throat locked tight. Against the weight of history, what could one man say? He stammered, voice cracking. Why? Why tell me I'm too special if all I'm meant for is to die? The warrior's eyes flickered then, just barely pain, maybe, or regret. For the first time, Ethan saw something beyond fury in him. Something human, fragile even. But the silence of the tribe behind him pressed like stone. The torches swayed. In the wind, horses shifted, muscles quivering. Ethan stood frozen, rifle trembling in his hands, as the desert night itself seemed to wait for judgment, and he understood, with bone-deep certainty, that his life no longer belonged to himself. It belonged to whatever verdict the warrior and his tribe had come to deliver. The firelight threw wild shadows against the walls of the ranch house, flickering like restless spirits. Jesse stood on the porch, his rifle trembling slightly in his hands, not from fear of dying, but from the weight of the choice before him. 1,000 eyes gleamed in the torchlight, belonging to the riders who had encircled his land like a living wall. The stillness between them carried more power than gunfire. It was a silence sharpened by centuries of pain, betrayal, and the memory of blood spilled on this very soil. At the heart of it all stood the warrior man. His bare chest caught the fire's glow, muscles etched like stone, his long black hair whipping with the night wind. His tribal jewelry rattled softly, a rhythm like bones and memory, echoing in the dark. He didn't need to speak. His presence alone was command enough. Yet Jesse's heart beat wildly, knowing words would soon fall, and whatever was spoken might tip the balance toward peace or ruin. Inside the ranch house, Clara clutched the curtain with trembling fingers, her pale face bathed in the orange wash of torchlight. She could see the warrior man clearly, standing so proud, so unmovable. And in that moment, she realized he wasn't the enemy the town always whispered of. He was a man carrying the weight of hundreds of lives on his shoulders. His people looked at him not with fear, but with trust. He was their shield, their voice, their anchor. Her eyes flicked to Jesse, the man she had loved for years, who had once promised her safety in a world too cruel for tender hearts, now looked smaller in the face of something greater. She remembered his words from just a day ago. "You're too special for me." At the time, she had thought it strange, almost dismissive, but now she understood. He hadn't said it because he didn't want her. He said it because he believed he couldn't protect her from the storm he knew was coming. The warrior man raised His hand and the horses shifted, the riders falling into a tighter circle. His voice finally broke the silence, deep, resonant, filled with both grief and steel. "This land does not belong to you," he said, each word slow and deliberate. "It breathes with the bones of my fathers. You build walls on our graves. You drink from rivers that once carried our children's laughter. And still you call us thieves." Jesse's throat felt tight, as though dust and fire choked him at once. He wanted to argue, to stand tall like a man defending his claim. But another part of him, a quieter, deeper part, knew the warrior's words held truth. Jesse had worked this land with blood and sweat, but he had never stopped to wonder who it had been stolen from before his time. The ranch dog barked once, breaking the silence. Jesse lowered his rifle just slightly. "I didn't take it from you," he said hoarsely. "I only know how to survive on it. My family's bones are here too." The warrior's dark eyes narrowed, and for a moment the torches seemed to lean closer, the entire circle breathing as one. His chest rose and fell, slow and steady, and the scar that cut across it gleamed like lightning frozen in flesh. "You live," the warrior said, "while my people starve. You call it survival. We call it erasure." The words struck Jesse harder than any bullet. He felt Clara's presence behind him, her fear and her faith pressing at his back. He thought of her father, buried beneath the cottonwoods. He thought of the townsfolk who would sooner lynch a man than listen to his story. He thought of the way Clara had looked at the warrior, not with hate, but with recognition, as though she saw in him something Jesse never could. Jesse swallowed hard. "Then tell me," he said finally, his voice low but steady. "What do you want from me?" The circle of warriors shifted, the creak of saddles and the snort of horses filling the night air. The warrior stepped forward, closer to the porch, until the firelight revealed the deep lines of exhaustion on his face. His eyes locked on Clara through the curtain, just for a moment, before returning to Jesse. "Tomorrow," the warrior said, "you will choose." Then he turned his back, the riders parting to make way as he walked toward the darkness. One by one, the torches followed until the night swallowed them whole. Jesse stood frozen, his rifle still in his hands, but his world utterly changed. The night air was thick with the scent of burning pitch and sweat. The crackle of torches set the dark ranch yard alive with shifting shadows, every flame dancing across the tense faces of warriors and the pale figure of the cowboy standing stiff on his porch. His rifle hung low, his finger close to the trigger but not yet ready to pull. He wasn't sure if firing a shot would save his life or end it quicker. The circle of horses parted with a commanding gesture, and through the gap strode the warrior. Man, shirtless beneath the heavens, his chest painted with scars that told their own stories of battles and survival. Beads and bone ornaments rattled softly as he walked, each step slow and deliberate, his long black hair moving like a dark river behind him. The flicker of torchlight gilded his face with bronze fire, highlighting the hard lines of his jaw, the stern power in his eyes, and the quiet grief that seemed to live beneath his strength. The cowboy swallowed. He remembered the words the warrior had spoken only yesterday, standing in the dust of this very yard. "You're too special for me." He had thought those words a strange kindness, maybe even a dismissal. But now, with the weight of an entire tribe looming behind him, he realized those words had carried warning. The silence between them stretched, broken only by the restless shifting of horses and the snapping of flames. Then the warrior's voice, carried out, low and steady, but ringing with authority. "You shelter what is not yours," he said, his English heavy with the rhythm of his people's tongue. "And because of this, the earth shakes with anger. We stand at your gate not for war, but for truth." The cowboy's grip tightened on his rifle. "Truth? I don't understand what you want from me," he said, though deep inside, part of. Him feared he already knew. His eyes flicked to the upstairs window where he knew she was watching. The pale woman who had stumbled into his life 2 weeks ago, running from a past she wouldn't speak of. The warrior followed his glance. A flash of pain crossed his face, fleeting, but real. Then he straightened, squaring his shoulders like a man holding the sky itself. She carries blood that binds her to us, the warrior said, his words falling like stones into the night. She is not only your guest. She is the daughter of a promise broken long ago, and now we have come to claim her. A murmur rippled through the gathered riders, their torches shifting, sparks drifting into the air like stars torn from the kedji. Heavens! The cowboy's jaw clenched. He felt the weight of his isolation, then no neighbors for miles, no lawmen close enough to hear a single shot, no allies except for his own fear and stubborn heart. I can't just hand her over like she's a sack of grain, he said, his voice shaking despite his effort to keep it steady. She's under my roof. That means she's under my protection. The warrior man's eyes hardened, yet there was no mockery in them, no cruelty. Only a heavy sorrow that seemed too large for one man to bear. He stepped closer, so close that the cowboy could see the firelight reflected in his pupils. You think this is about protection? The warrior asked, his voice quiet now, intimate, as though the two men stood alone instead of surrounded by 100 armed riders. It is about fate. It is about debts carried across generations. Her presence has awakened the tribe. You keep her, and you will inherit not just her life, but her enemies, all of them. The cowboy felt the ground shift beneath him, not physically, but in the marrow of his bones. He looked at the warrior man, at the tribe, at the desert night, filled with fire and tension. He realized then that he had never been truly alone out here, no matter how many acres of silence stretched between his ranch and the horizon. There had always been eyes watching, spirits judging, histories older than his family name carved into this land, but none of that answered the only question that mattered. What was he supposed to do now? The warrior man lifted his chin, and his voice rang out again, carrying over the desert like a drumbeat. Tomorrow, when the sun rises, you must decide. Return her to us, or prepare for the wrath that comes when promises are broken. Then, with a single gesture, the riders pulled their torches high, the flames roaring as if to seal his words in fire. The tribe began to wheel their horses away, retreating like a tide back into the night, leaving the cowboy alone on his porch, rifle heavy in his hands, sweat chilling on his skin. Inside the house, he heard a quiet sob from the upstairs room. The cowboy closed his eyes. He felt the weight of both their lives pressing down on him. By dawn, the world he knew would be gone, and in its place, something far older and far more dangerous would arrive. The night had grown heavier, as though the very stars were holding their breath. The circle of warriors stood unbroken, torches guttering in the wind, their shadows thrown high against the desert rocks. The ranch yard smelled of smoke and sweat, the air thick with tension. Caleb's hands ached from gripping the rifle too tightly. His knuckles had gone white. Across from him, the warrior chief stood like a carved figure of the earth itself, bare chest gleaming with sweat and firelight. Long black hair tumbling over his shoulders, tribal jewelry clinking softly with every breath. His presence was overwhelming, commanding, as though he carried centuries of his people's anger and sorrow on his broad shoulders. Between them, silence stretched taut as a bowstring. Then, the young woman Eliza stepped forward from the safety of the porch. Her boots clicked against the wooden steps before sinking into the dust. She moved carefully, as if walking a tightrope strung between two worlds. Her eyes flicked from Caleb's trembling rifle to the chief's stern face, then back again. "Stop this," she said, her voice unsteady but strong enough to cut through the night. The chief's dark eyes softened for the first time. His hand, still raised, lowered slowly to his side. The circle of mounted warriors shifted but did not break, their torches crackling in the silence. "You spoke words you did not understand," the warrior said finally, his voice deep as rolling thunder. "You told her she was too special, and yet you would keep her here, chained by your own fear. Do you know what that means?" Caleb swallowed hard. His throat burned. "I never meant harm. He faltered, searching for words that didn't come easily. The rifle in his hand suddenly felt like an accusation. He lowered it, step by step, until it hung loosely at his side. "I just didn't think I deserved her, or this life, that's all." Eliza's breath caught. Tears stung her eyes, though. She held them back. She had heard Caleb's doubts before, whispered late at night when he thought she was asleep. But never had he spoken them aloud with such naked honesty, especially not in front of strangers of enemies. The warrior chief studied him, his jaw clenched. "Every man thinks himself unworthy," he said, almost bitterly. "But the measure of a man is not whether he feels worthy. It is whether he stands anyway." The words landed like stones in Caleb's chest. For the first time in years, his heart stirred with something other than fear. He glanced at Eliza, her face pale but resolute, her eyes locked on his as if silently begging him to see what she already knew. "I've been running from ghosts," Caleb said hoarsely, his gaze never leaving hers. "But I don't want to run anymore. Not from you, not from her, not from myself." The circle of warriors shifted again, murmurs rippling through them like wind in tall grass. Some looked angry, others curious, but all watched their chief, waiting. The chief's eyes narrowed, studying Caleb as though peering into the marrow of his soul. Then, with a slow, deliberate gesture, he lifted his spear high into the night sky. The warriors fell silent, their horses restless but restrained. "You will prove it," the chief declared. His voice carried like a drumbeat through the yard. "Not with words, but with how you live. She is not yours to keep, nor ours to take. She belongs only to herself. If you love her, then walk beside her, not above her." For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then the chief lowered the spear and turned. With a single command in his native tongue, the riders began to withdraw. Horses shifted, torches lifted, the circle slowly breaking like a tide pulling back into the ocean. Eliza exhaled, a sound between a sob and a laugh. Her knees nearly buckled with relief. Caleb dropped the rifle entirely, the weight gone from his hands, and crossed the dirt to her. He caught her trembling hands in his calloused ones. "Sorry," he whispered. "For everything I didn't say, for everything I almost lost." Eliza pressed her forehead to his. "Just don't run anymore," she breathed. "That's all I ever wanted." Above them, the torches faded into the distance until the desert was dark again, the only light the stars reclaiming the sky. The silence that followed was different, now no longer heavy with threat, but with the fragile promise of a future. Caleb held her close, the smell of her hair mixing with the lingering smoke of the night. For the first time in years, his heart didn't feel like a battlefield dot, and though the chief and his warriors vanished into the horizon, Caleb knew the truth of the man's words would remain with him forever. A man is not measured by his fear, but by how he stands in spite of it.